Today, I'd like to tell you about my top 10 tips for writing technical English well. Number 1, you can't explain something if you don't understand it yourself. A lot of people rush their assignments and even their scientific papers sometimes, and there are gaps in their own knowledge, which mean that at some point they get stuck when they're writing and they make up something that sounds fair but maybe isn't quite right, and unfortunately it compromises the quality of the text. So before you begin to write something technical, make sure that you understand, for example, exactly how an engineered product functions. Make sure you understand about the processes, the materials, the manufacture, things like that, and make sure that you clarify things that you need to clarify before you begin to write. And this goes for the vocabulary too. So you need to decide upon the correct words for all of the components, and you should do that at the beginning when you're at the stage of making sure that you understand everything. Number 2, think carefully about the text structure. It's important for the text to flow logically, and it's important for it to have a good first sentence and last sentence. The first sentence, the opening sentence, is usually the sentence that people read and then ask themselves, well, does this interest me? Is it relevant to my work? And it determines whether they then go on to read the rest of the text. So if you like, it's the bait. The last sentence, the closing sentence, is very often a summary, or it mentions what the most important point was again, and it's often something that will stick in people's minds. And between those two sentences, the opening sentence and the closing sentence, you want to have a logical flow of content, so moving from point A to B to C, that kind of thing, without any gaps, without making big jumps from one topic to another, without explaining something, without referring to something and then explaining the fundamentals later in the wrong place, that kind of thing. Think carefully about the structure of your text and come back to it later when it comes to editing the text. Number 3, word order. Word order goes together with sentence construction, and both word order and sentence construction are a bit different in English from in German. Your standard word order in an English sentence is subject, verb, object. And although you can have exceptions to this, sometimes you can begin a sentence with a preposition, as is very common in German. Sometimes you can begin with the subordinate clause and then have a comma, then move on to the main clause. But really, these should be the exception rather than the rule. And I'd advise you to try to write shorter sentences, partly because that's more natural in English, and partly because it's easier to write shorter sentences correctly. The longer a sentence gets, the harder it is to get the grammar right. And one thing to remember, which is especially important, is if you want to join two sentences together, because they're relevant, because they're closely related, then you can't join two complete sentences using a comma in English. That's something called a comma splice, and that's grammatically wrong. You can instead join them with a colon, or a semicolon, or a dash. And one very common mistake that people make is if they write a sentence like, it is true that the machine is broken, they'll then put a comma before the word that. And you may pause, and when you're saying that sentence, it is true that the machine is broken, but you will never write it with a comma. Number 4, capital letters. This is fairly simple in English, we use fewer capital letters than are used in German. You need a capital letter at the beginning of a sentence. You need a capital letter for people's names, for company names, and for brand names. There are one or two exceptions, one or two extra places where you might want a capital letter, but they are so rare that there's no need for me to mention them right now. Actually, I'll go back on that and say one place where they're useful is if you have an acronym, so an abbreviation where each letter represents the first letter of a word, like LED for light emitting diode. If you don't want to use dots to show that the words are abbreviated, then you should capitalize the letters instead. And if you do join two complete sentences using a colon, a semicolon, or a dash, then the first letter of the second sentence should then be lowercase. It should not be an uppercase letter, should not be a capital letter in the second sentence. Number 5, don't join nouns together using hyphens. An example of this, a washing machine. A washing machine is a device, and the noun is written as two separate words. It is not written as washing-machine, and it's not written as washing machine with no space in it. It's washing space machine. And the two options in English really are to write the phrase as two separate nouns, or to push the two nouns together and write them without a space and without a hyphen. An example of that would be teamwork. That's written as a single word. There are very few cases where a hyphen can be used to join two nouns together. It can be used sometimes to make a phrase that's an adjective, but that's a different topic. Number 6, remember to include the correct articles. So words like a, an, and the. I think the people who have the most problems with this are usually people from China and Russia, and not so much our German students. They will often write something like, bolt attaches the cover. Now, when that's written in singular, you need an article before the word bolt. You need to write, a bolt attaches the cover, or the bolt attaches the cover. On the other hand, if there are several bolts, so it's a plural noun, and then you can leave the article out. You can then say, bolts attach the cover. Although sometimes it might sound better and make sense if you're referring to specific bolts to say, the bolts attach the cover. Number 7, one word for one thing. I get a lot of students and they'll think it shows their prowess, their skill at English, to swap between words in a text. So in one paragraph, a component will be called a gear, and in the next paragraph, it'll be called a wheel, and in the third paragraph, it'll be called a circle. Don't do this. It's very confusing in a technical text, and in some cases, say in a patent, it could even have legal implications. So please, when you're writing about machines, about processes, about software, one word for one thing. And this case of one word for one thing, a little aside, it's often done by people who are trying to sound fancy, and this also applies to things like connectors. And words like therefore, and thereby, and hereby, and moreover, and furthermore, and things like that. And if you put these connectors into a text, which is bad and illogical, it will not make your text better. If, on the other hand, you write a text which is logical and well structured from the beginning, you'll find you need fairly few of these words. Number 8. This and that, and these and those. The words this and these are used to describe an object, singular, or several objects, plural, which are close and relevant and immediate. And the words that and those, singular and plural, are used to describe objects which are more distant. They refer to things which are maybe not immediately relevant to the current situation, or less relevant, or perhaps longer ago, related to other people's work rather than your own. And a common mistake is to state something in a sentence and then begin the next sentence by saying that was performed in order to purify the oil. Now in English it doesn't make any sense, because if you're referring back to the last sentence, that's something immediate, near, and something you want to emphasize. You want to emphasize this near connection. So you'd say, this was performed to purify the oil. If you look out of a window and someone says to you, this car is red, but that car is blue, you would expect that the red car is closer to your point of observation than the blue car. Sometimes this and that can also be used in terms of politeness if you're complaining about something. If you walk up to someone and you say, this is unacceptable, that's a bit more direct and aggressive than saying, that is unacceptable. And you might want to bear that in mind if you need to complain or if you're watching people's behavior. Number 9. Don't assume too much reader knowledge. It's easy when you're writing about your own work, which you understand well, to think, well, I don't need to explain that. It's obvious. And very often it isn't obvious. And this kind of thinking is a bit lazy, and it tends to result in a text which is poorly thought out and not so readable. Basically a poorer quality text. So think about this from the point of view of the reader. How much will the reader know, and how much do you need to explain? Think about this throughout the writing process, and think about it when you come back to look at the final version. There's a famous saying in England, assume makes an ass out of you and me. Number 10. When you think you're done, you should edit your text. No one gets it right first time. Some people may get a fair version first time, but it could be better. If you go back to it, think about what's important, what's less important, exactly how you want the flow of ideas to run through the text, what hints you can build into the text to guide the reader and to make sure that they understand it. You can think about things when you edit your text, like the rhythm of the words, whether it's on the right kind of level, whether you should use easier words or more precise, more advanced words, that kind of thing. Always come back to your text though, always edit it at the end. And some people find that it's useful to leave a few days before they come back to the text, before they edit it. And some people, alternatively, if they're working on the computer, they'll change the font so that it looks like someone else's text, and they'll say, okay, now I'm going to put on a different hat, now I am the reader. Does this seem like a good text? Is it easy to understand? And there's also a famous quote from an author. I looked for the name of the author today, and unfortunately I couldn't find it. But the author said, the best way to write a good book is to write it, then burn it, and then write it again from memory. Because the second time around, you leave out the unimportant parts, the parts you forget, and you've thought about it so much, so hard, that the structure and logic in there is better. And this really is something that you should be doing in your editing stage of the process.